on my way up to Canaan land. I'm on my way up to Canaan land. I'm on my way up to Canaan land. On my way, glory, hallelujah, I'm on my way. It's a mighty hard climb, but I'm on my way.
Hello, glad you could join me. In this video, we'll be fact-checking some of the scientific claims made by Extinction Rebellion in support of their political narrative. This is a rather broad topic. The military types might describe it as target rich. So where to start? Well, a good place to start might be to take a closer look at Extinction Rebellion spokesperson, Dr. Rupert Read. If you remember, in my first video on Extinction Rebellion, I said that my interest in the movement was triggered by one of their people appearing on BBC Question Time. That individual was Rupert Read. I said then that he had only uttered a few words before I concluded that he presented a serious problem, and having had a close look at his works, I found nothing that might contradict my initial impression. Rupert is a philosopher. In his Wikipedia entry, he is described as an academic and a Green Party campaigner, and also a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. He is currently a reader in philosophy at the University of East Anglia. He is a published author with 2 books on Wittgenstein, but it is his last publication that might be of interest to us. The title of this work is This Civilization is Finished. Now there's one for your Christmas list. No question mark at the end of that title, I notice. We're all doomed, and Rupert in this book presents us with a blueprint for his new world order. Not lacking in ambition is our Rupert. If we look at the comments, we find something of interest. One of the readers states the following, and I quote, "This book gets straight to the point. The authors are not trying to convince the reader about the reality of our current predicament, climate change, ecosystem collapse, overconsumption, pollution, species extinction." So Rupert doesn't seem to trouble himself much about tedious detail in this book, or describe a plausible mechanism that would lead to the end of civilization as we know it. This, it appears, is presumed. You might be forgiven for suspecting Rupert of being some sort of millenarian cult leader. He paints with a black, doom-laden brush, but he seems less inclined towards detail, which is a bit of an issue in my opinion. But that's enough of the background. Let's take a look at our hero in action. But before we start, you should be mindful that the snippets I will use here are taken from a lecture Dr. Reed gave at the UCL to a group of primary and secondary school children. So the ages in his audience would range between 11 to 16, but if the front row was typical, most were around 11 to 12, I'd guess. So let's listen and learn.
This is really, really important, and it's partly important, as I've said, because it's hard. Because what I want to say to you is this, that the so-called leaders of this country have failed you, that your teachers, for the best of their intentions, are failing you, that your parents and their generation, again with the best of their intentions, are failing you, and that so far I'm failing you. And we're all failing you because you are in a terrible predicament. It's worse than you've been told, almost certainly, probably a lot worse.
Well, hardly subtle, is it? Everyone has failed them. Trust no one. Listen to no one. Except, of course, for Extinction Rebellion. Do I need to detail what's going on here? I don't think so. This is almost textbook cult-like behaviour. The message from the platform is clear, and if you thought it couldn't get any worse, we have this.
This is about whether you have a future. People probably sometimes ask you, what are you going to be when you grow up? But we've reached a point in human history where the question also has to be asked, what are you going to do if you grow up? I'm really, really sorry to have to say this to you. You know, it doesn't feel good. but this is the truth, and I think it's too late for anything but the truth. And I take inspiration from a young person who I'm privileged to know personally, and who I think is one of the greatest people alive, Greta Thunberg.
This doom-laden tripe is being directed at children, for God's sake. It is enabled by their teachers. They've just been told from a platform at the university that they might not even get to live much longer. What the hell are these people doing? But Rupert makes a mistake. In order to turn up the dial, he makes a claim, and claims can be checked.
Do you remember what happened last summer? We had a terrible heat wave last summer, yeah? I mean, it was nice for some of the time, right? You could go onto the beach and stuff like that. But it went on, and it got hotter and hotter. And then what started to happen is our crops started to die. And many crops in this country, their yields were down by about a third. That means there was a third less food coming from them. Now, that heat wave stopped in July, but what if it had gone on into August or September? Well, then the crops would have been down by 50%, 60%. And sooner or later, you reach a point where there just isn't enough food. That's the kind of thing that is likely to happen, very likely to happen, during your lifetimes, unless we manage to address this crisis.
The children were asked to cast their minds back to last summer's heatwave, and Dr. Reed informed them that this resulted in a drought and a crop failure. The crops, they were told, were reduced by a third, leading to shortages. Reed went on to explain to the kids that if the heatwave had gone on a bit longer, then the crops would have been reduced by 50 or 60% as well. Well, that's pretty grim, isn't it? The problem is, I don't remember there being much of this on the news. Do you? Well, of course not, because it never happened, at least as described by the Prophet of Doom. Here's a graph which displays crop yields in the UK. The main problem, if you remember, was the wet early season, which was not helped by the heatwave, obviously, but it was hardly catastrophic. Rupert is spinning it. Depending on the type of crop, the reduction in yield ranged between 5 to 7%. If you totaled the reduction over all the crops, it was something like 11%. Hardly catastrophic, but the important point to remember is that this is in comparison to the previous year, 2017. If we look at the entire series going back to 2000, we see that this is not untypical, and it's not even the worst. We have dips in 2013, 2004, and the worst yield was in 2001. Crop yields vary. Who would have thought that was possible? Anyway, I think we've seen enough of this creature. Let's move on. In a recent YouTube video, Martin Daubney interviewed Extinction Rebellion environmental spokesperson Donohue McCarthy. I will link to the full video in the description box below. Mr. McCarthy is not only a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion, but has also appeared on television programs as an expert in environmental issues. McCarthy's views are not untypical and are being propagated in our schools by Extinction Rebellion, who have been invited in by head teachers to give talks to children. In this interview, he presents what he claims are scientific facts, and it is these alleged facts which will be our main focus. But as usual, a little background might be helpful. McCarthy is an Irish national. He spent his childhood in Cork. It is there that he went to university and studied anatomy and physiology at the National University of Ireland. But his main interests seemed to lay elsewhere, and he subsequently trained with the Irish National Ballet and danced professionally with the Dublin City Ballet, the Vienna Theatre Ballet, and the Royal Opera Ballet in Covent Garden in London, where he has lived since the mid-1980s. He developed an interest in politics around the mid-90s, apparently due to an epiphany he experienced in the Amazon rainforest. He became a Liberal Democrat local councillor due to his involvement in local environmental campaigns. He was later elected to the Liberal Democrats' federal executive, where he served for 2 terms. His political ambitions seem to have hit the buffers, for after a while he was asked politely if he might reconsider his membership, after which Mr. McCarthy and the Liberal Democrats parted ways. He is an author and has written for The Independent, where he had a weekly environmental column called Home Ecologist. He has also appeared in several TV shows, such as the BBC 2 series It's Not Easy Being Green, Sky Television's Green Britain Week and for ITV's How Green Is Your House. So, quite the eco-pundit is Mr. McCarthy. So that's where he's from, but our interest is in his involvement in Extinction Rebellion and his role as a high-profile representative. So let's fact-check Extinction Rebellion's eco-expert.
There's a threat of that happening. A number of scientists have stated that the world has got around 3 major breadbaskets where most of our wheat, our rice and our flour originates. And they're saying that if 2 of those are hit by an extreme weather event simultaneously, there would be a massive disruption to the world's food supply. That could lead to an amazing amount of disruption in governments across the world, and so therefore they could result in mass starvation, and that's what that is based on.
Do you honestly think billions of people are going to die?
It's a possibility, and the fact is that if we do have runaway climate change, which is now seriously a possibility, scientists have said 4 to 6 degrees rise in temperature is incompatible with civilization as we know it. That's the science telling us that. And the fact is that if you look at the IPCC projections, we're at the top level of the predictions rather than the bottom, and that's terrifying.
He makes 2 claims here. The first claim is that scientists have predicted world food shortages and mass starvation. And the second claim is that this is because we are seeing temperatures increase at the higher end of scientific projections, which Mr. McCarthy claims might be in a range of between 3 or even 6 degrees. Both of these claims are false. The first is a misrepresentation, and the second is simply untrue. So let's deal with the first claim, that scientists have predicted mass starvation. The main problem we have is that the source of these rather scary statements is quite vague. He uses statements such as, science has told us, and scientists say, without really telling us which scientists are saying what, and more importantly, where they're making these claims. So we have to play detective. This is obviously less than ideal, but lucky for us, McCarthy uses certain phrases in his claim that closely match a series of articles that appeared in the media in 2017. The headline of the article in the Mail was, "Is the world heading for a food apocalypse?" Well, that does seem pretty scary, doesn't it? But the headline ends with a question mark. And if we apply Betteridge's law of headlines, which states any headline that ends in a question mark can be answered with the word no, so the answer to that is no, the world is not heading for food apocalypse. Well, okay, I thought that wouldn't convince you. So let's dig a little deeper, and let's see if Betteridge's law applies or if Mr. McCarthy is correct. The series of articles in question appeared widely in the mainstream media. All the main newspapers covered the story, as did the BBC at the time. The headlines were all much the same. Most implied an impending food catastrophe, the cause of which would be, of course, climate change. As usual, you needed to be fairly deep into the articles before you started to trip over the inevitable caveats. What was almost never mentioned in the article was the original purpose of the report on which they were based. The report was produced by Boston University's Pardee Centre. Its title was Multiple-Breadbasket-Failures. The purpose of the report was to explore the global impact of food production failures. They were considering what could go wrong, the potential impacts, and how they might be mitigated. There are obviously many things that might lead to local crop failures, geopolitical issues, financial crises, market collapse, loss of production diversity, inappropriate industrial farming, and of course, climate change. They were detailing a series of potential scenarios which they hoped would be prioritised for future study and research. They were not making a prediction. They were presenting a range of possibilities that might merit further study and research. So it was not the original study that is driving Extinction Rebellion's claims of mass starvation, but the articles that appeared in the popular press. McCarthy's claims that science is predicting mass starvation and the collapse of civilization triggered by climate change is a misrepresentation of the original intent and purpose of the study he uses in making his claims. The second point we need to look at is related to the first because he makes quite an extraordinary claim while making his prediction of doom, and it was easy to miss.
And the fact is that if you look at the IPCC projections, we're at the top level of the predictions rather than the bottom, and that's terrifying.
This is not simply a misrepresentation, it is patent dishonesty. That is not what the IPCC projection is. And given his self-declared expertise in this area, he would be fully aware this is not what the IPCC are saying. This is a graph produced in the IPCC AR5 report technical summary. I know a lot of people don't like graphs, and I can sympathise. It looks complicated, but it's not. The coloured spaghetti represents different computer simulations. We don't care what they are, or how they work, or even the merits of these. We are simply looking at the range or the spread. If we look at the left-hand side, we see some numbers. These go from -0.5 to 2.5. The interesting point is that we have a 0 near the bottom, and the scale only goes up to 2.5 Celsius. So the graph is not using absolute temperatures like you might see on your greenhouse thermometer, but it represents temperature anomalies for the period indicated at the bottom of the graph, which runs from 1990 to 2050. Do we care what anomalies are? No, not really, because we are looking at the range here. The technical stuff we can set aside. If we look at the right-hand side of the graph, we can read the range of temperatures predicted by the different models, and it goes from 0.5 to 2.5 Celsius. But there is a black line bumping along the bottom, isn't there? And this line is labelled observations. This is the real temperature data, the observed temperature. You don't need to be a statistician or a climate science whiz to notice it's at the lower end of the predictions, not, as McCarthy claimed, at the higher end. In fact, the projection and the observed temperature data diverges as time goes on. There are reasons for this divergence, which we won't go into in this video. We might cover it in a later video, but for now, let's focus on what has been said by McCarthy and what is contained in the AR5 report produced by the IPCC. The very worst case scenario that you could make from the IPCC report is that we would, by mid-century, have a 2.5 degree rise in global temperature when compared to pre-industrial global temperature. But that is assuming that the hottest model is true and ignoring the observational data which seem to be running at the lower end of expectations. This is the evidence. It is found in the IPCC report, which you can verify by following the link in the description. This is nowhere near 4 or 6 degrees. The real temperatures are well below the model average projection, which will be in the middle of the coloured spaghetti somewhere. Yet head teachers are inviting these people into our schools to frighten children with this total bollocks. Perhaps even worse is the last point we will take a look at. McCarthy often claims that the science tells us that there is a very real possibility of a runaway greenhouse effect if we hit 2 degrees warming. The world will be doomed, or so he claims. Our planet will become a slightly larger version of Venus. Little wonder children are frightened by what they hear. This fear-mongering is about as low as you can stoop in pursuit of an ideological goal. But it's not untypical of what we witness from the new progressive left. They are terrorising children with propaganda, simply to get them on board their political programme. Runaway climate change is another example of a worst-case scenario being cherry-picked and exploited by Extinction Rebellion, and it is presented as a very real possible outcome, which is predicted by the science. It is not. The scenario presented by McCarthy is exactly that, a scenario. It can be found in the IPCC RCP 8.5 report. We won't worry too much about the technical details here. I'll provide a link in the description box below if you want to know more. But RCP 8.5 is the most severe of the 4 scenarios used in the IPCC's AR5 report. McCarthy is misrepresenting it for propaganda purposes. RCP 8.5 describes a worst-case scenario. It is not considered either likely or probable, but is actually the most improbable scenario you will find within any IPCC publication. This path to climate genocide requires so many implausible assumptions about key factors, so many radical and unlikely changes in long-standing trends, that it can, for all intents and purposes, be dismissed as incredible. For example, we would have to burn all the coal, oil, gas, tar and shale on the planet, a lot of which is not even economically recoverable at present. Globally, we would have to make changes to our industrial base that makes little sense. For instance, we would have to return to coal for production and transport, as well as for energy production, and that's just for starters. It's not something that's going to happen. This particular scenario is not business as usual. It is the exact opposite of that. The planet in this scenario would look like something from a steampunk fiction novel. Just in case you were inclined to allow McCarthy the benefit of any doubt relating to his fundamental honesty, near the end of the interview we have this.
Where the fires are already seeing are out of control, where actually cities, major cities are underwater, because Jakarta has announced they're going to move their capital. The Indonesia capital is going to move its capital. Lagos is already lapping in its water. So in the third world, which doesn't have the resources that London has to tackle rising sea levels, they're already suffering the impacts, and that will cost trillions of dollars for those cities to move.
To any reasonable person listening, the obvious implication is that Indonesia is being forced to move its capital because of sea level rise, which is obviously the result of decades of climate change. As McCarthy puts it so colourfully, the sea is already lapping at the city. Sounds dreadful and pretty damning, doesn't it? Who could help but be convinced that immediate and drastic action is required when confronted by facts like these? And here we have another issue with McCarthy's worldview, because what he states as fact on examination is found to be untrue. Oh, it's true that Indonesia has to move its capital, but the reasons offered by McCarthy for this are total bollocks. The fact is that the sea level is not rising, but parts of the city itself are sinking. Areas north of Jakarta, including the seawall designed to protect the city, are falling at an alarming rate due to subsidence. This is because the city doesn't pipe in enough drinking water, so the population has to rely on wells, which extract water from shallow aquifers, leading to large-scale subsidence as the water level drops. There are also other environmental and political factors involved, as you might expect. But McCarthy's claim in relation to climate change and sea level rises being a major contributory factor is totally without foundation. It's untrue. Extinction Rebellion could have spun this to fit their narrative. They could have claimed that the subsidence in Jakarta would make it more vulnerable to sea level rises, and that at least would have had some truth about it. But that's not what we witnessed in the interview, is it? The narrative is everything. Facts, if inconvenient, are simply ignored. Now the question is, dear viewer, how many primary school children would be capable of challenging this narrative, particularly when these stories are told to them by adults with support from the authority figures around them? McCarthy and Extinction Rebellion are in the business of instilling fear and apprehension. The equation is simple. Fear over fact produces more members for the cause, and they achieve this by using hypothetical scenarios and misrepresenting these scenarios as settled science. This, in my opinion, is dishonest. They will overlook the inevitable caveats that accompany the worst-case scenarios they use to frighten school children, simply to support their own narrative. I could find not a single shred of scientific evidence that would support the worst claims made by McCarthy and Dr. Reed. They are snake oil salesmen of the very worst kind. They should be excluded from our schools and challenged at every opportunity, because, as we have witnessed, they will misrepresent when they can and simply lie if they have to. And having seen a presentation made by Dr. Rupert Read, the main thrust of which is join us or die, it will only be a matter of time before we have a tragedy on our hands. Nor can the climate change lobby stand to one side clutching their pearls. Scientists have engaged in advocacy and agitated for policy change. They have turned the dial up to 11 and kept it there. It is almost predictable that they would lose control over the narrative, and now they face the very real possibility that the science and facts are becoming irrelevant as well. We end our adventure at this point. I hope you found something of interest in this video. If you would like to support my channel, I now have a Subscribestar page. If you're unable to support my work through Subscribestar, you can share, like or comment. It's all good. Thank you for watching.